Perhaps first of all we should say that we live in a very turbulent time. In fact, I see now there's a threat of a major trade war between the United States, China and Europe in the offing. And we haven't had such a threatened position, a trade war of this character, since probably 1931. And it helped to precipitate the Great Depression. And I think that it's no exaggeration to say that we could also be heading for a depression. After all, we've been in the deepest crisis of capitalism over the last 10 years, at least since the 1930s. They haven't got out of this crisis, and they're worried now about another world slump on top of it. So it's a period of huge turmoil in society, not only in Britain but internationally. And therefore there's enormous challenges before a Labour government. And obviously what kind of Labour government is decisive for us. We've had a number over the years. We've had a number of Tory governments as well, and perhaps you could say, well, you know, the Tory government, when they get into power, at least they act in a very ruthless manner as far as their own class is concerned, as far as big business is concerned, as the rich are concerned. And it'd be a good thing if the Labour government that we elect will be just as ruthless in carrying out policies in the interests of working people in the same kind of way. Clearly we're talking about Clause 4, it's a very broad thing, broad subject, insofar as, a century ago, the Labour Party had a conference in London in February 1918 under the impact, I would say, of the Russian Revolution, and agreed to adopt a clause, Clause 4, Part 4, which said that to secure for the workers, by hand or by brain, the full fruits of their industry, based upon the common ownership of the means of production, distribution and exchange, and the popular administration thereof. And that was a big step forward for Labour. It became a socialist party. When it was formed in 1900, it was just a workers' party in Parliament. But 1918 and the adoption of Clause 4 transformed the party, and the object was socialism, a realisation that capitalism could not solve the problems of the working class. On the contrary, that capitalism was a cause of the problems of the working class, whether it be poverty, squalor, homelessness, unemployment or world war. They could be laid at the foot of capitalism, and that if workers were going to have the full fruits of their labour, literally the full fruits, then the only way that could be achieved would be on the basis of doing away with capitalism and the profit motive, and creating a society of common ownership where the banks and big industries were owned and planned under the control of ordinary working people and run not in the interest of profit but the interest of people's needs. Of course, that was a big question, a burning question in the 1920s and the 1930s because of the deep crisis. And I think possibly, as I said earlier, it's more relevant now than before because of a return to deep economic crisis, and what lies before us in the next 2, 3 or 4 years will be even worse probably than what we've had before. But Clause 4, although it was part of the constitution of the party, was a dead letter. That the leaders of the Labour Party in particular saw it as a nice little phrase, but nothing that could be introduced in practice. Probably the nearest you had to that was the 1945 Labour government, which did nationalise certain industries of the railways, of steel, of coal, of electricity, of the Bank of England, a number of industries. But they were generally bankrupt industries, as a matter of fact, at the time, or needed an enormous amount of state aid in order to bring them back on their feet. And the Tories, who hated the idea of nationalisation, were very lukewarm and were prepared to accept nationalisation of those industries at that time from a Labour government. But as we saw as well, that the kind of nationalisation that was brought about wasn't from workers' control and the workers taking initiatives and be able to have their say in industry. It was a top-down nationalisation where people like lords and ex-owners and managers who were put in charge of the industry, and the workers themselves had no say. That doesn't mean to say that nationalised industries weren't welcome. They were. Like the coal industry, that the miners in 1947, when the industry was nationalised, were welcomed this. So it was a big advance. Whereas they had pithead bars for the first time, and various other reforms were introduced, which were big advances on what they had under private ownership. But nevertheless, they didn't have the say. And above all, these industries that were taken over, as I said, were mainly unprofitable industries or needed an enormous amount of investment. They weren't, in the words of Nye Bevan, the commanding heights of the economy. That is, the real controlling interest of an economy, the decisive sectors of the economy. They remained in private hands. And therefore, the 80% always dominated and dictated to the 20%. Quite naturally, and therefore they were quite pleased about cheap coal, cheap electricity, cheap transport. All these things were very good for them, but it didn't alter the class nature of society. Although in the 1950s there was talk that yes, classes did not exist anymore, that things were going to get better and better, and so on. These illusions were built up, and yet obviously these illusions have now been shattered as we're in the 21st century. And things are not going forward, they're going backwards. And above all, the conditions of the working class are deteriorating day by day. I mean, last week I had a report about Amazon, for instance, this big giant multinational, and the working conditions within that firm are what you call Dickensian conditions, where the workers are treated like slaves, like prisoners. And where one woman worker who was pregnant, who asked to be put on lighter duties because she was standing for 10 hours at a time, was refused because the company would decide, as they said. Now, this is the inhumanity you have in industry where the drive is for profitability and not the needs of the workers or the population as a whole. I won't mention Sports Direct, where you had that scandal where a woman was afraid to take time off and give birth to a baby in the toilet. Such conditions you have in Britain at this time is a disgrace from any point of view. But that's not just in these industries, it's across the board. Even in the private sector, the public sector rather. The squeeze that is on to make workers work harder, to squeeze every ounce of profit from them for less. And that's a lot of conditions that we have. We're going backwards. You've got rickets appearing in London, of TB, of homelessness, of poverty, of squalor, of millions of children living in poverty. We see the beggars on the streets. We see the deterioration, the decay of life, if you like, for the majority of people, for working class people. Of course, there's a polarisation of wealth, and those at the top who earn salaries that we can only dream about, well, they've got their utopia. For them, everything's fine, everything's hunky-dory. But for the mass of the population, who have to toil every day and worried about where the next meal or where the rent money comes, then this is the situation where we can solve this problem, but not on the basis of capitalism, as was the case in 1918, so is the case today. You know, and for a Labour government, you know, we can have, and we will fight for a Labour government, and it's come with a left-wing programme, and they talk about nationalisation of certain industries, of the railways, or taking the franchise back, of the utilities and so on. Very good, all this is a good initiative, and we support it wholeheartedly. But when it comes to the economy, we've got to say the truth. And that means that the only way you can control the economy is to take over the commanding heights of the economy. Otherwise, the economy will dictate to you, not you will dictate to the economy. And that's always been the fate of Labour governments, even with the best of intentions, that they operate within the capitalist system, and while they try and operate in that way, they are dictated by the laws of capitalism. And the first law of capitalism is the drive for profits. If it's only profitable, then companies will go somewhere. They will set up somewhere. They will employ someone, only if they can make those profits. If they cannot make those profits, they will not do it. It's as simple as that. And if it's more profitable to invest in works of art, or in antiques, or in property speculation, then they will do it. Because that's all they're interested in, not the outcome, but the fact that they make juicy profits at the end of the day. But this is where the problem comes. That's why we're in favour, I would say, of bringing Clause 4 back. Because when Tony Blair got rid of it in 1995, the substitute was that we should welcome competition and the rigours of the market. And these were code names for, yes, PFI and privatisation and flexibility of labour, all those things which are now affect the working class to an enormous degree, where there's a race to the bottom, you know, that we have to compete. You know, it's not our fault, but we have to compete, therefore you must accept lower wages. You have to retire later in life, and you're under greater pressure. And this applies not only in Britain, it's Germany, it's Japan, America, everywhere. But working people are the ones that suffer, being pushed down constantly. And therefore the only solution to this is to get rid of that system which causes these problems in the first place. And rather having a wasteful economic system, which we do, through unemployment, through short-term working, of a lack of capacity, of falls in productivity of labour, because of a lack of investment. Because at the end of the day, investment doesn't take place if it's not profitable. That's the only reason. That's the dictate of capitalism. And even if we were the government tomorrow, and we had a fine Prime Minister here who's going to chair this meeting, we would be under the dictates, if we didn't change the economic system, at the mercy of the economic system. And those who control the banks and the big multinational corporations that make the financial and economic and industrial decisions on a day-to-day basis. In other words, the boards of directors have more power than an actual government itself. They determine where the economic development takes place, and not the government. And although I've been under many governments which have tried to coax Labour governments, when you need industry in South Wales, where grants are given, where tax-free bonuses are given, and when industry are coaxed to come in for a temporary period until that time lab is up, and then they move out again. And we see these areas, rather than a proper equal distribution of wealth and a planning of the economy, putting industries where we need them, it's all about the chase for profits. And therefore, our communities are left bare with the collapse of the mines, for instance, the closure of the mining industry, where village after village in Yorkshire, in South Wales, and every other mining area have been turned into a desert because of capitalism, not through any other reason. It's not human nature. Is that human nature? Or should it be one of using the benefits and the resources we have for the needs of people, rather than seeing the scandal of old people being forced into homes where they cannot afford it, where they don't get the right treatment because care workers have allocated 15 minutes to take care of a patient? What a disgrace. And yet we have enormous resources available that we can transform all this, and more so, if we put it to work for us, rather than put it to work in the interest of profit itself. And that's what the Labour movement was founded on. That's why the working class founded the Labour Party and then adopted the idea of Clause 4, this socialist aspiration. But it's more than an aspiration. It's an essential if we're going to control the economy. It's an essential thing if you're going to deliver for working people. Otherwise, and I think Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell have hit on it, there's going to be a strike of capital. There's going to be an attempt to undermine the Labour government. And although we can try and avoid it, they own industry, they own the economy. They have the banks in their control. And therefore they will attempt to blackmail and cajole a Labour government to drop its radical policies and introduce more policies interested or more adaptable to capitalism, the interests of capitalism itself. That's why it's a big challenge. And I say, well, we can't buck it. You know, at the end of the day, if we are going to plan the economy, you know, you can't plan what you don't control. And you don't control what you don't own. It's as simple as that. And all we are saying is, we're not interested in nationalising, you know, the corner kebab shop or the chip shop. We're not interested in that. What we're into is the big multinational corporations. They're the ones who own and control 80% of this economy, about 100, 150 of them, together the banks and the insurance companies. They should be taken into public ownership under democratic workers' control, not like they were in the past, where you had these boards from the top run like capitalist firms, and no different from the capitalist firms in reality. But the people who know how to plan their interests, how to run their factories, are the people who are employed in the factories. They can tell you how to streamline production. The only problem is, on a capitalist basis, if they streamline production, then their fellow workers will be out of work. Instead of, let's streamline production and lower the amount of work we need to do collectively. In other words, you should all benefit by a lowering of the amount of hours we have to work with the same pay or more pay, but lower the hours. That's why technology should be put, not to squeeze people out of work and scare them to death, but to help them, allow them to make labour work for them rather than the machine works for the boss. In other words, we must ensure that the technology and machinery is used to lighten the burden of work, not make it more heavy for those who remain in work. That can't be done in any other way than on the basis of a socialist economy. Capitalism forbids that. It's only interested in profits. We say, that's enough now. You've caused enough agonies in this world. What we want to do is organise production in a much better way, guaranteeing everybody work, guaranteeing rising living standards, and also the fact that the lower of hours in work will allow people the free time to involve themselves in the running of society itself. Rather than a minority, a privileged minority allows them to do this, where the rest of us have to work long, long hours. Reducing the hours will allow us to participate in the things we don't normally do, in art, science, culture, yes, and government. But, you know, workers are excluded from that by and large. And only because of the hours that they work and the difficulties they work. Lighten those burdens and you'll change them. You'll change society. And then you'd liberate not only working people, you'll liberate women as well from the burden that they have and the secondary position they have in society. But it can be done on the basis of the overthrow of capitalism and the bringing about of socialism. What a view, what a vision to be offered working people in this country. And they would love it if only that was done. Thank you.